One of the very many things that I love about fantasy football season is how fast-paced everything moves right here. It is so pivotal to keep up with things because things change literally day by day. That's why I work overnight over here to make sure I'm giving you the most value possible with the most up-to-date information for you to win your fantasy football matchup in every single week. So today we need to go over the top 30 running back rankings in week 2 fantasy football, and I'm going to be up until 4 in the morning making sure that I get these videos out to you guys and provide you guys with as much value as possible. So please make sure to go down there, drop a like, and hit that subscribe button to show your support to me. So let's start out with number 1 here. On the list, I have to put this guy in his own tier. I think he simply belongs in his own tier to me right now in fantasy football, and it's Christian McCaffrey of the San Francisco 49ers. Taking on the Los Angeles Rams in Los Angeles this week, who cares? Honestly, this guy is so tremendous. Like what he did in week 1 versus everybody thought a great defense of the Pittsburgh Steelers, except me. Never been big on the Steelers defense. Nobody was really shocked with what Christian McCaffrey did, but it was the manner in which he did it. It was dominant. It was a dominant performance. I'm expecting that week in and week out from Christian McCaffrey. That's why he belongs in his own tier. I've got no questions with him. Dropping in the next tier, it's good tier as well. I mean, this is a great tier. Not a good tier, it's a great tier. Saquon Barkley at number 2, taking on the Arizona Cardinals in Arizona this week. Now, I know, Saquon Barkley and the rest of the Giants, they sucked in week 1. So it may sound like a little bit of a bold take to some people, or just like a stupid take, just based on the output that we got from Saquon Barkley and the rest of the Giants offense this week. Honestly, when you're in that type of a matchup, it's impossible to produce any real fantasy football output when you drop down to 40 points. Because at that point, the team is pulling starters. They don't want to get guys hurt. That's what happened here with the New York Giants. But the big deal here, and the reason he's at number 2, is not only because do I think he's going to bounce back and he's a great player, the matchup is massive. I mean, he gets such a break in the schedule right here in week 2, going up against the Arizona Cardinals. Possibly the worst team in the league. Who knows? I know this though, Saquon Barkley is not going to bust again in week 2. Number 3, Tony Pollard taking on the New York Jets, man. Obviously, on paper, super tough matchup. The Jets absolutely stifled the Buffalo Bills on Monday night. So I don't have a problem with people who have a problem with this high of a ranking. The reason why he's this high is very simple. I think Tony Pollard is going to have an elite fantasy football season. I think he's going to be absolutely elite. This guy is on a great offensive line. He's in a great offensive situation, and this team is very run heavy. Congratulations if you have Tony Pollard. Honestly, that's all I can say about Tony Pollard because I don't care what the matchup is for Tony Pollard. This is a very tough matchup, no doubt about it, but it does not really matter to me because I know he's handling the volume and I know he's a very efficient running back. As you can see on the screen, 5 yards a carry in week 1. Moving down to number 4, I've got Nick Chubb of the Cleveland Browns taking on the Pittsburgh Steelers in Pittsburgh on Monday night right here. So what he proved in week 1 was everything we already know. This dude is still a freaking beast. 5.9 yards per carry in week 1 versus a Cincinnati defense. This guy is still fresh as ever. He is aged not a bit. He is so consistent and he consistently handles 20 plus touches in a game. I love Nick Chubb this week. I think it's a very easy matchup. The Steelers got absolutely gouged on the run in week 1. I love this matchup, and I think, honestly, everybody knows this, but I think Nick Chubb is going to have a great year, specifically from a target perspective without Kareem Hunt, and we saw it in week 1. He had 4 targets in week 1. I think it's going to continue, and I think he's going to continue to provide more value in the receiving game. So dropping down to number 5, I've got Bijan Robinson of the Atlanta Falcons here, taking on the Green Bay Packers in Atlanta this week. So obviously in week 1, Bijan Robinson did not disappoint. He had a tremendous NFL debut. Got a receiving touchdown. Dude was making moves on everybody. Super efficient, 5.6 yards per carry. This guy is a beast, and everybody knows it. Nobody was questioning here. The problem is the volume is not all there, and that's a reason why he's not in the elite group of tiers right here. The volume simply is not there as of yet. And honestly, I would not be surprised if it's not there for basically the entire amount of the season, because this offense is so run heavy that they want to incorporate a second running back. And honestly, I think the way their offense is set up, being so run heavy, it actually supports two running backs being fantasy football relevant in this offense. They've got a great offensive line. They've got a great offensive-minded head coach in Arthur Smith. So I actually don't have a problem with Bijan Robinson sharing touches. It's not ideal, but they both have enough upside to be fantasy relevant. Obviously, Bijan is great. He's just so explosive. He deserves to be in the top 5 right now. Moving down to number 6, we've got Austin Eckler of the Los Angeles Chargers taking on the Tennessee Titans in Tennessee. Obviously, this one's contingent on if he plays. I don't know if you've seen, he's got an ankle injury he's dealing with. I'm filming this on Tuesday night at midnight, so we don't have enough information. There's no practice logs yet. We don't know what the week of practice is going to look like for Austin Eckler. But if he does play, he's absolutely a must guy. You can never sit Austin Eckler. Even if he's at 90%, he is still a great fantasy football player. The matchup is definitely tougher than it was last week for sure. The Tennessee Titans defense, as bad as they are through the air, they are not bad against the run. They do not let teams run on them, and it showed in week 1. But either way, you never sit Austin Eckler. He absolutely deserves to be in the top 6 right here, regardless if he is 100% or not. Moving on to number 7. I love my guy, Travis Etienne of the Jacksonville Jaguars, taking on the Kansas City Chiefs in what is probably the best fantasy football matchup of the week. Last week, we had the Los Angeles Chargers versus the Miami Dolphins. That one disappoint. I expect this one to be very, very similar. And let me just say this really quick, in the humblest way possible. I hope that you were listening to me, not about my Calvin Ridley take in the offseason, but I hope you were listening to me about my Travis Etienne take all offseason. I had been shouting it from the rooftop. This guy is going to be great in fantasy football, and he started out red hot to his elite season that he is going to have in week 1. This guy was all over the field in week 1. He had over 20 touches in the game, was very efficient, got a rushing touchdown, 18.9 fantasy points in half PPR formats. The targets are really important here because he's going to continue to see a large target share in this offense out of that backfield. I love Travis Etienne. This is the matchup of the week from a fantasy football perspective. Put Travis Etienne comfortably in your lineup right here. Dropping down to number 8, I've got Josh Jacobs of the Las Vegas Raiders taking on the Buffalo Bills in Buffalo this week. Now, this was not an ideal start to the season for Josh Jacobs at all. Obviously, what he did last week, he averaged 2.5 yards per carry, 8.1 fantasy points on 19 rushes. Like, he had the opportunities, he just simply wasn't good. The reality, though, is that this matchup last week was tough. Denver's defense is a real defense. And Buffalo's no slouch either. Like, Buffalo is definitely going to be a legitimate defense that is going to give Josh Jacobs trouble this week. But I think in this situation here specifically is that since Josh Jacobs missed so much time during the offseason, he wasn't participating in football activities either through practices or preseason games, so his body just takes a little bit of time to get adjusted again. I think that he's going to get his body adjusted after week 1. He's taken hits already. He's got a good defense that he went up against. I think his body gets back into a rhythm, and I think that he mentally is going to get back into the NFL groove starting in week 2. Number 9, I've got Joe Mixon taking on the Baltimore Ravens in Cincinnati this week. Obviously, every Bengal player sucked in fantasy football in week 1. No question about this one, guys. This one is so clear to me, though, because he's still clearly the running back 1 in this offense. This team has no running back competing for touches with Joe Mixon, and that's the ultimate reality here. And Joe Mixon, as bad as the Bengals were last week, he was still pretty efficient. 4.3 yards per carry on 13 rushes. This team's going to run the ball more this week. It's just going to be a matter of how much. I think Joe Mixon, we could expect him to get 16 to 20 touches in this game. And I think that Cincinnati is going to be way more competitive offensively in this week 2 matchup. Kenneth Walker is at number 10, taking on the Detroit Lions in Detroit this week. Obviously, much like the Cincinnati Bengals, really bad week for the Seattle Seahawks. It was a putrid week for their fantasy football options. So this may seem like a little bit of a higher ranking as well. But here's what we need to remember about Kenneth Walker's week 1 performance. Out of everything that you took away against the Seattle Seahawks with the Rams matchup, the one thing I want you to take away is that he was still very, very efficient. 5.3 yards per carry on 12 rushes, and he still led this backfield. Zach Charbonnet had 3 carries. So Kenneth Walker is not relinquishing real touches to Zach Charbonnet, very similar to Travis Etienne not doing the same for Tank Bigsby. Kenneth Walker and the Seattle Seahawks, I think they're going to improve in week 2, and that's why I've got Kenneth Walker at number 10. Number 11, I've got Alexander Mattison taking on the Philadelphia Eagles in Philadelphia this week. Now, this one I'm not too worried about, guys. I know that Alexander Mattison, it wasn't ideal in week 1, but it was not bad either. He ended up giving you 11.9 fantasy points in half PPR, and he had a reception touchdown, basically carrying that week. I'm not worried about this one, because he's the clear running back 1 in this offense. Minnesota does not have an option behind him. And the reality in week 1 was that Kirk Cousins threw the ball 44 times in that week 1 matchup against Tampa Bay. I don't think he's going to keep that up. I don't think he's going to go and throw 44 more passes on Thursday night against the Philadelphia Eagles. I just don't think it's going to happen. But what I do know is going to happen is Madison is going to stay involved in both the passing game and the running game of this Minnesota Vikings offense. That will definitely have a better game in week 2. Probably not going to win the game, but I do think it's going to be a better offensive performance. Number 12, I've got Ramondre Stevenson taking on the Miami Dolphins in New England this week. So the big story here, I think, with Ramondre Stevenson dates back to the offseason. When the Patriots signed Ezekiel Elliott, a lot of people just jumped ship off Ramondre Stevenson. And a lot of people are using that week 1 matchup and the week 1 output as leverage and as basically vindicating themselves that Zeke is going to be a major problem for Ramondre Stevenson. But Ramondre Stevenson still had 11.9 fantasy points in week 1. And the reason is because he's always a receiving option in this offense. Mac Jones does not have a big arm. Mac Jones is not mobile. So whenever the pocket collapses, Ramondre Stevenson is going to be targeted. And it showed last week. 6 receptions in that game, 64 receiving yards. Ramondre Stevenson's value comes from being a pass-catching running back. And last week, it wasn't an efficient week. Taking on the Philadelphia Eagles defense, it was not an efficient week. 2.1 yards per carry. I think he's going to have way more efficient weeks than that. Last year, he averaged 5 yards a carry. I'm not worried about Ramondre Stevenson, and I think this week kicks that off in this matchup right here against a much more inferior opponent versus the Miami Dolphins. Number 13, I've got Jahmyr Gibbs taking on the Seattle Seahawks in Detroit this week. So last week, the big problem with Jahmyr Gibbs is that the volume was very, very scarce, as I have been predicting all offseason. I kept saying all offseason, Jahmyr Gibbs is not going to be volume dominant immediately out of the gate. I got a lot of pushback for it. But that's the reality that we just saw in week 1. Now, I think that David Montgomery is going to remain involved in this offense. But what I will say, and this is obvious to everybody who watched the game on Thursday night, Jahmyr Gibbs is clearly the better and more explosive player between him and David Montgomery. This is not close, guys. Jahmyr Gibbs is such a better player, and I think that this offense is going to continue to get him more involved because he's that good. They can't afford to get this guy on the bench. They have to get him on the field, and I think that this week is going to be a better matchup, actually, because I think that Kansas City's defense is actually a little bit tougher than we thought. Just a side note for fantasy football defense rankings in the future, because Kansas City would not be surprising if I featured them in one of those videos. Derrick Henry at number 14, taking on the Los Angeles Chargers in Tennessee this week. So here's the thing about Derrick Henry. Derrick Henry is still capable of a big play. He did it in the receiving game this past week. He had 3 targets and 56 reception yards in that game. The dude can still hit big plays. He's still a beast too. Obviously had a highlight reel stiff arm in that game as well. But here's the reality with Derrick Henry, and it's a little bit grim. Tennessee is clearly trying to limit his workload because they want to keep him fresh and because they know he's an older player, that he's not going to be able to handle 30 carries like he used to back in his heyday. That's the reality here. And you know it's true because this was one of the most underrated pieces of news that we've gotten all week this week. Tyjae Spears, the rookie running back for the Tennessee Titans, outsnapped Derrick Henry in this game and was in on every single third down play for the Tennessee Titans. That is a very important piece to monitor. Now, it's not that Tyjae had a bunch of touches. He didn't. But it is very important to note this right here because Derrick Henry is clearly getting limited touches in this offense for a reason. This is a much easier matchup this week against the Chargers, but is a very, very bad offense though. And that's why he's down here at number 14, along with the workload issues that I have. Number 15, my guy, Breece Hall of the New York Jets, man. All offseason, I gotta start it like this, man, because all offseason, I had been saying, do not forget about Breece Hall. So many people forgetting what he did in just a short period of time. Averaged 15 fantasy points per game last year, over that number actually, was extremely efficient running the ball. The guy is a freaking beast, but so many people forgot about him because he got injured. And then exactly what happened here was when Dalvin Cook signed, a lot of people just jumped ship of Breece Hall like they did with Ramondre Stevenson. And I was saying, don't panic and actually buy this guy or draft him low, because he was dropping like the 5th round of drafts. Well, those buy low days, they're over after Monday night against the Buffalo Bills. Breece Hall was on a pitch count, and it was so clearly the best running back in that New York Jets backfield. It wasn't even freaking close, man. The guy averaged 12.7 yards per carry. Unreal number, will not sustain that. It was a couple of big plays that he got here. But this guy is so efficient and he's so explosive. The matchup obviously is tough against the Dallas Cowboys this week, but this guy is so freaking good at football that he's always going to have the big boom potential because of the player that he is. I'm going to flex him in most situations this week. Number 16, I've got Aaron Jones taking on the Atlanta Falcons in Atlanta this week. Obviously, this one is also contingent on the fact if he plays or not. Aaron Jones pulled up with a hamstring injury this week. And honestly, this is a very similar situation to Derrick Henry's in Tennessee. So when you think about Aaron Jones and what he showed you last week, this dude can still friggin' ball. He was unbelievable last week. He had a fantastic week, mostly led by the big plays that he got against the Chicago Bears. This dude can absolutely still ball. But also, Green Bay is making a concerted effort to limit his touches as well. A.J. Dillon led the backfield in carries, and he was way less efficient than Aaron Jones was. They want to keep him fresh because this team plans on making a playoff run this season. So it's hard to argue after watching the film that this guy is still really good, but it's also hard to argue with the Green Bay Packers perspective because on the limited carries that he had, this dude still pulled up with a hamstring injury. So you can't always count on the big plays with Aaron Jones, and that's the unfortunate reality here, but he still has that potential every single week, and the matchup here is decent in week 2 against the Atlanta Falcons. I'm fine with starting Aaron Jones again. Just be careful. Watch out for that injury report this week. Miles Sanders at number 17, taking on the New Orleans Saints in Carolina. So the biggest piece to Miles Sanders' fantasy football value at this point is the volume. The offense sucks. The offensive line sucks. Even with Chuba Hubbard's involvement, though, Miles Sanders was so clearly the guy. And also, what I have been saying all offseason leading up to the season as well, is that since this offensive line is so bad, Miles Sanders is going to get a plenty of dump-offs. And that's exactly what happened in week 1. 6 targets in week 1, 26 reception yards in week 1. This is going to continue, but the matchup obviously here is tough against the New Orleans Saints, so he's not a must start for me, but absolutely in flex territory just based on the volume play he possesses. Najee Harris at 18, taking on the Cleveland Browns in Pittsburgh this week on Monday night. So here's the thing about Najee Harris, and it really isn't just for Najee Harris. I'm just not big on overreacting to week 1 fantasy football. I know that it's very easy to do that. There's a lot of guys that you could overreact to, like T. Higgins 0 that he gave you, Dallas Goedert's goose egg that he gave you. Like, you could overreact to a lot of things that in the end won't really even matter. But I came away this weekend after the week with a couple of guys in mind that really I was very concerned about. One of them was Drake London. For obvious reasons, this team does not pass the ball, so his fantasy upside is not as high as I thought it would be coming into the season. Garrett Wilson, for obvious reasons, no more Aaron Rodgers, and Najee Harris. I am concerned about Najee Harris, but it's not for the reasons that you may think. So looking at Najee Harris in week 1, there were 9 total rushes in this backfield in week 1, and Najee had 6 of them. So Najee Harris, and I can tell you from watching this game live, Najee Harris was the starter. This game got so out of hand that they started giving the ball more to Jaylen Warren to get a spark going, and that didn't work either. Najee Harris is the leading backfield guy, and he will continue to be that guy because Tomlin loves him. He was a first-round pick, and he is considered a team leader. I can tell you that for a fact right here. Najee Harris will still lead this backfield. What I'm worried about is this offense. I simply think this offense sucks. This offense looks exactly like it did last year because Matt Canada is still the offensive coordinator. That's the reality here with Pittsburgh. So I think that his ceiling is actually going to be relatively low for the rest of the season, but I do think that Pittsburgh will put up a better effort in week 2 versus the Browns just because of how embarrassed they got on their own home field in week 1 versus San Francisco. Number 19, I've got Dameon Pierce taking on the Indianapolis Colts in this matchup on Sunday. So here's what we know about Dameon Pierce. Aside from, the bad fantasy output, let's discuss what we know. Houston's offense is bad. There's no question about that. They've got a rookie head coach with a rookie quarterback. It's a bad combination. Dameon Pierce leads this backfield. That is a fact right here. I watched that game live as well. Devin Singletary only got more involved when the game was basically over. That's when Devin Singletary started to handle carries. And this is a better matchup this week for Houston. Baltimore was tough. Indianapolis is going to be a much better. I think this is going to be a much better week for Dameon Pierce. Number 20, David Montgomery taking on the Seattle Seahawks in Detroit this week. I'm honestly really fascinated to watch this one play out. I mentioned it with Jahmyr Gibbs earlier. I think that Jahmyr Gibbs is clearly better. I think everybody would agree with that. Let me know in the comments if you don't. I think we all agree that Jahmyr Gibbs is simply a better football player than David Montgomery. But David Montgomery still leads the backfield, and he led the backfield in week 1. He had over 20 carries in that game, and he has the red zone and goal line upside on a very good offense with a top 3 offensive line. The problem here is that he's still a very inefficient player. He's simply just not that great of a football player, and Gibbs is going to get more involved. I think since he's so good, this team can't keep this guy on the bench. But David Montgomery will never be irrelevant just because of the contract that they signed him and because they want him to be that Jamal Williams type of running back. So this week, I think that he's going to be fine. Still a pretty strong flex option. Number 21, I've got James Cook taking on the Las Vegas Raiders in Buffalo this week. Here's the positives for James Cook. Amidst the disgusting loss that they occurred on Monday Night Football against a Zach Wilson-led New York Jets, James Cook is still the clear running back 1 in this offense. We knew it heading into the season, and it was clear on Monday night. And he was so close to a reception touchdown in week 1. If you watch that game, you probably know the play I'm talking about. Josh Allen was literally just a couple inches behind him, and he would have had a touchdown if that ball was perfectly placed in tight coverage. But the reason that James Cook is always going to be lower on these rankings in reality every week is because Buffalo running backs simply just don't have enough upside. They don't run the ball that much, and the offensive line is really not that good. But this is a much easier matchup this week. Taking on the Raiders this week, I think James Cook is going to be a just fine fantasy option this week. Number 22, Isaiah Pacheco taking on the Jacksonville Jaguars in Jacksonville this week. Obviously, Pacheco remains a very unstable play. Like, if you're playing Isaiah Pacheco, it's a very bold move, but I respect it because this offense in this matchup is going to be crazy good. Last week, I predicted that the Chargers and the Dolphins would be the matchup of the week for fantasy. This week, I'm predicting it's going to be Jacksonville and Kansas City. The problem is that Clyde Edwards-Helaire still had 6 touches in this game. This offense was in total disarray without Travis Kelce. I think they're going to get it ironed out this week. And I think that since it's just a high-scoring potential matchup here, Isaiah Pacheco is a worthy play just because of that right there. 23, I've got Javonte Williams taking on the Washington Commanders in Denver this week. So this is not quite the triumphant return that Breece Hall had from the knee injury. It wasn't quite that level, right? But it still wasn't bad. I mean, you're looking at it, he had 19 opportunities in this offense this week. So it wasn't like it was some irrelevant week where he only got like 6 or 7 touches in this offense. But the problem here is that Samaje Perine is involved, and he will continue to be involved probably. While he is a descending asset and Javonte Williams is an ascending asset, it's still going to be Samaje Perine still splitting some carries in week 2 for the Denver Broncos. And that's my problem in week 2. But for future weeks, Javonte Williams is an ascending asset in fantasy football. Number 24, I've got Jamal Williams taking on the Carolina Panthers in Carolina this week. I've said this one all offseason. I did not think that this situation in New Orleans was going to be nearly as good as the one in Detroit for Jamal Williams, and it showed in week 1. He is not an efficient running back. 2.5 yards per carry because the offense is worse and the offensive line is much worse. Now, I'll give him credit here. Tennessee does have a stout run defense, and it showed in that week as well. And Carolina did get gouged in the run game in week 1, so this could be a bounce back week for him. But I'm just not huge on Jamal Williams. I gotta be honest with you. And keep in mind also that Kendre Miller might be back in week 2. Just food for thought. Khalil Herbert at number 25, taking on the Tampa Bay Buccaneers in Tampa Bay this week. The biggest concern here with Khalil Herbert is that Roschon Johnson outproduced Khalil Herbert in fantasy football in week 1. But I can tell you from watching that game, that was mostly in garbage time that came. Roschon Johnson was not leading this backfield. That was Khalil Herbert. Khalil Herbert led this backfield. And honestly, Green Bay's defense is pretty real. Like, they're a pretty real team. So I think that Tampa Bay's defense is no slouch either, but I am very confident still in Khalil Herbert moving forward just because I know that he's going to have more efficient weeks than a 3-yard per carry week. 26 Tyler Algier taking on the Green Bay Packers in Atlanta. This may surprise some people. He's making an appearance in the top 30 this week. Now, obviously, like I discussed earlier with Bijan's clearly the better player. Like, nobody's debating that right now. This one's actually pretty simple to me, though, and I went over in the Bijan part as well. I think this offense is good enough to support 2 legitimate fantasy football running backs. I think this offense is going to go back-to-back in NFL rushing attempts in 2023. They did it last year, led the league in rushing attempts. I think they're doing the same thing this year. They've got a great offensive line. They've got a great offensive head coach. Like I said, I think they could support 2 running backs. One of them is elite, and one of them is pretty good option week to week. The matchup isn't great, but I'd still prefer him over Brian Robinson at number 27. He's the clear running back one in his offense. That's the big difference here. He had the touchdown. The touchdown saved his week. He had 13.1 fantasy points. That touchdown absolutely saved his week. This guy just isn't efficient, guys. And I was never big on him coming out of college, out of Alabama. So I've never really been a big Brian Robinson guy. The simple fact here with Brian Robinson is that when you're in a bad offense, you simply just can't count on a touchdown from a player who's in a bad offense to save his week every single time that he goes out there. This is also a much tougher matchup too against the Denver Broncos. Denver shut down Josh Jacobs last week, so I don't think they're going to have much trouble doing that with Brian Robinson this week. But obviously, since he's volume guy, he's definitely a volume play with not much upside, to be honest with you. 28, Raheem Mostert against the New England Patriots. This guy is the exact opposite of Brian Robinson. Total opposite. This guy is a total upside play because he's on a great offense. And he's also the clear running back one in this offense as well. There's just not much volume there. There's simply not enough volume there. I mean, 12 total opportunities in week 1 in a lightning matchup shows you how much they're committed to the run in this offense. He belongs in the lower tier in the top 30 because of that lack of volume. And this is also a tough matchup as well. New England on the road, it's going to be a tougher game for Miami than it was in week 1. But Mostert is still capable of hitting the big play, which is why he belongs at the bottom here. 29, Dalvin Cook taking on the Dallas Cowboys. Yeah, he makes my top 30, strictly because of volume here. Dalvin Cook did lead the backfield in touches, but it will not be for long. And I wouldn't be surprised if this week is the end of Dalvin Cook having the most amount of touches. Dalvin Cook is a descending asset in fantasy football. 100%. If you could find a trade partner to trade him on the low because of the name that he has, I would absolutely pursue something like that. This week, he's still acceptable because of volume, but I would be looking to trade this guy and try to capitalize on the big name and maybe take advantage of a rookie in your league. Number 30, I've got Gus Edwards rounding out the top 30, taking on the Cincinnati Bengals here in Cincinnati. The Gus bus has arrived, but it is not because he's a great player. He's simply just not a great player. They have no other choice. Obviously, J.K. Dobbins, done for the year. Justice Hill, he's the goal line guy. Gus Edwards is here because of the offense he's on. He's on a very, very good offense, and he's going to be the guy who handles the carries between the 20s. So I could totally see him ripping off like a 10-point game just because of volume here and just because the offense is very good as well. Now, our 2 bonus guys that I'm throwing in here, just in case Austin Eckler or Aaron Jones don't go, I've got Rachaad White taking on the Chicago Bears and then James Conner taking on the New York Giants. Rachaad White is here because he's a volume play. Understand, though, if you do play him, he's super inefficient. 2.3 yards per carry in week 1. This guy is not an efficient player, and I was saying don't draft him during the offseason. If you have him, though, he's a bonus option right here. I would not go out of my way to start Rachaad White in any week. James Conner, same type of deal. Very low upside play because of the offense right here. He's a better player than Rachaad White, but he's on a worse team. The Cardinals are awful. So that's what makes him such a low upside guy. But from a volume perspective, and because he's a better player, totally understand. Maybe taking a flex option on him. So let me know what you think of these rankings in the comments below, and what week 2 questions that you need answered, and I will go down in the comments and answer almost every single question I can. And if you want to see the top 30 wide receivers in week 2 fantasy football, click on this video right here.